The fluorescent lights of the hospital room hummed a relentless, sterile tune, a counterpoint to the ragged rhythm of his own breathing. Arthur lay still, a landscape of pale sheets and thinner skin, the geography of his life rewritten by the sudden, sharp violence of a stroke. One, he had been a man of quiet corners and solitary walks, a life lived in the gentle cadence of routine. Now, his world had shrunk to the dimensions of his bed, his body a traitorous vessel. His daughter, Jessica, stood at the foot of the bed, her arms crossed, her face a mask of weary impatience. She was a woman built of sharp angles and sharper words, her life a frantic symphony of ambition and acquisition. She saw not a father, but a problem, an asset that had depreciated into a liability, a roadblock on her meticulously paved highway to success. "The doctors say you'll need round-the-clock care," she said, her voice devoid of warmth, clipped and precise like the closing of a briefcase. "They're talking about a long-term facility. The cost is considerable." She let the word hang in the air, a leaden weight in the sanitized space between them. Arthur said nothing. His silence had always been a language he refused to learn, and now, with his speech stolen by the stroke, it was a chasm she had no desire to cross. He simply watched her, his eyes, still clear and sharp, a silent testament to man who remained behind the wreckage of his body. He saw the flicker of annoyance in her gaze, the way her fingers tapped impatiently against her arm. She wasn't looking at him, but through him, already calculating the logistics of his disposal. The silence stretched, filled only by the beeping of machines and the distant, muted sounds of the hospital. Then, the words that would ignite the slow-burning fuse of his revenge, words that would echo in the chambers of his heart long after she had gone. "You're a burden, Dad. A burden I can't afford right now." She didn't shout it. She didn't need to. The words were delivered with a cold, precise cruelty of a surgeon's scalpel, meant to cut deep and leave a clean, irreparable wound. She turned then, her heels clicking a sharp, dismissive rhythm on the linoleum floor, leaving him alone with the humming lights, the beeping machines, and the reverberating echo of her contempt. He closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in a silent, solemn vow. He was a man of quiet strength, a man who had faced down enemies far more formidable than a daughter's scorn. Too, he had built a life, a fortune, on the very principles she now so readily dismissed. Patience, observation, and a quiet, relentless application of will. And in that sterile, lonely room, as the world outside rushed on without him, Arthur began a plan. His revenge would not be loud or explosive. It would be quiet, meticulous, and devastating. It would be a lesson in value, a masterclass in the true meaning of wealth. And it would be a revelation, not just for her, but for a world that had long forgotten the quiet power of a man like him. Welcome, viewers, to a story that reminds us that the deepest wounds often come from those we love, and the greatest strength is often forged in the fires of disrespect. Join us as we uncover the story of a father's quiet revenge, a testament to the enduring power of honor, and the surprising ways in which true worth is ultimately revealed. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, because you won't want to miss a single moment of this incredible journey. Arthur's life had been a study in quiet discipline, a man of few words and even fewer pretensions. He had moved through the world with a deliberate, almost invisible grace. His home was a small, meticulously kept bungalow on the outskirts of the city, a place of worn leather armchairs, the scent of old books, and the comfortable silence of a life lived without the need for applause. He had been a widower for 2 decades, his wife, Eleanor, the only person who had ever truly understood the silent language of his heart. Together, they had raised Jessica, a child who had inherited her mother's sharp intelligence but none of her gentle spirit. From a young age, Jessica had been driven by a relentless ambition, a hunger for the validation that came with wealth and status. She had seen her father's quiet life as a failure, his humility a weakness, his contentment a sign of a small, unambitious soul. She had pursued a career in finance with a single-minded ferocity, climbing the corporate ladder with a ruthless efficiency that left a trail of bruised egos and broken relationships in her wake. She rarely visited. Her calls were brief and perfunctory, a box to be checked on her long list of obligations. Arthur had watched her ascent from a distance, a silent observer of the daughter who had become a stranger. He had never spoken of his own past, of the world he had inhabited before she was born. It was a world of shadows and whispers, of high stakes and higher principles, a world where a man's worth was measured not by his bank balance, but by his courage, his integrity, and his unwavering commitment to a cause greater than himself. There were no plaques on his walls, no medals in his drawers, just a single faded photograph on his bedside table, a picture of a group of young men in dusty, nondescript uniforms, their faces grim, their eyes old beyond their years. And on his forearm, a faded tattoo, a cryptic insignia that spoke of a brotherhood forged in the crucible of a silent, forgotten war. It was a life he had deliberately left behind, a chapter he had closed for the sake of the quiet, ordinary life he had craved. But the skills he had honed in that other life, the discipline, the patience, the strategic mind, they had not disappeared. He had simply repurposed them, applying them to the world of business with a quiet, unassuming brilliance. He had built a small, specialized consulting firm from the ground up, a company that operated in the discreet, high-stakes world of corporate intelligence. He was a ghost in the machine, a man who could see the patterns that others missed, who could anticipate the moves of his opponents before they were even conceived. He had amassed a considerable fortune, a fact he kept hidden from everyone, including his daughter. It was not a secret born of shame, but of a deep-seated belief that wealth was a tool, not a trophy. He had lived simply, his needs few, his pleasures small. He found contentment in the quiet rhythm of his days, in the company of his books, in the solitary walks through the woods behind his home. He was a man at peace with himself, a man who had no need for the validation that his daughter so desperately craved. And then the stroke, a sudden, violent storm had ripped through the quiet landscape of his life, leaving him stranded on the shores of a strange, new world. A world where he was no longer the master of his own destiny, but dependent, a patient, a burden. He had seen the look in his daughter's eyes, the cold, calculating assessment of his worth. He had heard the finality in her voice as she had pronounced her verdict, and in that moment he had understood that the time for silence was over. The time for lessons had begun. The first move was always the most critical. It had to be subtle, a whisper in the wind, a ripple in the water. Arthur, lying in his hospital bed, began to set the pieces on the board. He had one advantage, an ace in the hole that Jessica, in her arrogant dismissal of him, had never even considered. He had a witness, not a witness to her cruelty, but a witness to his past, a man who knew the truth of who he was, of the world he had come from, a man who owed him a debt of honor, a debt that was about to be called in. He managed, with excruciating effort, to reach for the call button. A young, cheerful nurse, a woman named Chloe, responded. She had been one of the few sources of warmth in the sterile coldness of his confinement. She saw not a burden, but a man, and she treated him with a gentle, respectful kindness that was a balm to his wounded spirit. He struggled to speak, the words a garbled, frustrating mess. But Chloe was patient. She listened, her brow furrowed in concentration as he fought to form the sounds. Finally, he managed to convey a single name, a name that would set in motion the quiet, intricate machinery of his revenge. And as Chloe left to make the call, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Arthur's lips. The game, as they used to say in that other life, was afoot. The first tremor in Jessica's carefully constructed world arrived in the form of a phone call. It was from a law firm she had never heard of, a small, unassuming practice with an office in a part of the city she rarely frequented. The lawyer on the other end of the line was polite, but firm. He informed her that her father had requested a meeting to discuss his estate planning. Jessica was annoyed. Her father's estate? A small bungalow and a modest savings account. Hardly worth the time it would take to drive across town. Still, it was a loose end that needed to be tied up. She agreed to the meeting, her mind already on the dozen other, more important things she had to do that day. The law office was as unassuming as its name, a small, discreet suite of rooms in a quiet, tree-lined street. The lawyer, a man named Marcus Thorne, was in his late 50s, with a calm, watchful demeanor and eyes that seemed to see more than they let on. He greeted her with a quiet courtesy that she found vaguely unsettling. There was an air of old-world formality about him, a sense of gravity that seemed out of place in her fast-paced, transactional world. He led her into a small, book-lined conference room, And there, sitting in a wheelchair, was her father. He looked smaller, frielier than he had in the hospital, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He was dressed in a simple, clean shirt and trousers, his hands resting quietly in his lap. Beside him stood Chloe, the young nurse from the hospital, her presence a silent, unspoken question. Jessica felt a surge of irritation. What was this? Some kind of pathetic attempt to guilt-trip her? She forced a tight, brittle smile. Dad, I didn't know you were being discharged. He was, Chloe said, her voice soft but clear. I'm his private nurse now. Your father has made arrangements. Arrangements. The word hung in the air, a small, innocuous-sounding word that somehow carried the weight of a hidden meaning. Jessica's eyes narrowed. She looked from her father to the lawyer, a flicker of suspicion, a tiny crack in the smooth facade of her composure. Marcus Thorne cleared his throat. Ms. Ashford, he began, his voice calm and measured, we are here today to discuss your father's last will and testament, and to make some adjustments to his current financial arrangements. He slid a sheaf of documents across the polished mahogany table. For Jessica glanced at them, her eyes scanning the familiar legal jargon. And then she stopped. Her breath hitched. Her carefully manicured nails dug into the leather of her handbag. The numbers on the page swam before her eyes, a dizzying, incomprehensible string of zeros. This had to be a mistake, a cruel, elaborate joke. The numbers were astronomical, a fortune that dwarfed her own considerable wealth, a fortune that she had never, in her wildest dreams, imagined her quiet, unassuming father could possess. She looked up, her face a mask of disbelief. This is impossible. Where did this come from? Arthur remained silent. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. It was Marcus Thorne who answered. Your father, Miss Ashford, is a man of considerable talents. He has spent the last 30 years building a highly successful and highly discreet business. He paused, letting the words sink in. A business that you are now, it seems, no longer a part of. The room was silent, save for the faint, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Jessica stared at her father, her mind reeling, her carefully ordered world tilting on its axis. The man she had dismissed as a failure, a burden, a relic of a bygone era, was a titan, a ghost in the machine who had built an empire in the shadows. And he had just, with the quiet, devastating precision of a master strategist, cut her out of it. The first lesson had been delivered, but Arthur was just getting started. The weeks that followed were a slow, agonizing descent for Jessica. The news of her disinheritance had spread through her social and professional circles like wildfire, whispered in boardrooms and cocktail parties, a delicious piece of gossip that stripped away her carefully cultivated aura of success. She was no longer the golden girl, the woman with the Midas touch. She was a daughter who had been cut off, the fool who had underestimated her own father. Her business deals began to unravel. Partners who had once fawned over her now treated her with a cool, dismissive courtesy. The sycophants and hangers-on who had once populated her life melted away like snow in the sun. She was alone, for the first time in her life, with a bitter, galling taste of her own failure. And through it all, her father remained a silent, enigmatic figure. He had moved out of hospital and into a luxurious, fully staffed penthouse apartment, a place of stunning views and quiet, understated elegance. Chloe, the young nurse, was a constant presence by his side, her devotion to him a silent, reproachful testament to Jessica's own neglect. Jessica tried to see him, to reason with him, to apologize, but her calls went unanswered, her messages unreturned. She was shut out, a ghost in her own father's new life. One evening, driven by a desperate, gnawing need for answers, she went to his apartment building. She was stopped in the lobby by a polite but unyielding security guard. Her father, he informed her, was not accepting visitors. As she stood on the cold, windswept pavement, a sleek, black car pulled up to the curb, and out of it stepped a man who commanded an immediate, almost palpable sense of authority. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his hair silver at the temples, his face a mask of quiet, unyielding strength. He moved with the easy, confident grace of a man accustomed to power, and the security guard snapped to attention, his deference immediate and absolute. The man's eyes, cold and gray as a winter sea, swept over Jessica, a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher in their depths. And then he was gone, disappearing into the gilded elevator, on his way up to her father's penthouse. Jessica watched him go, a cold, sickening knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Who was that man? What was his connection to her father? And what other secrets, what other hidden depths did the man she had so casually dismissed still hold in reserve? The game was escalating. The stakes were getting higher, and Jessica was beginning to realize, with a dawning, terrifying certainty, that she was no longer just a player. She was a pawn. The man in the tailored suit was a ghost from a past Jessica could not even imagine. His name was General Marcus Thorne, retired, though the title still clung to him like a second skin. He was a man who had recruited a young, brilliant, and fiercely disciplined Arthur into a world of shadows, a world where nations fought their wars not on battlefields, but in the quiet, deadly alleys of espionage and counterintelligence. He was a man who had seen in Arthur not just a soldier, but a strategist, a man with a mind like a steel trap and a will of iron. He was a man who had sent Arthur into the darkest corners of the world, into situations where a single mistake meant a silent, anonymous death. And he was a man who, when Arthur had finally decided to leave that world behind, had helped him build a new life, a new identity, a quiet, unassuming facade that had fooled the world, including his own daughter. He was not just a friend. He was a brother, bound by the unbreakable bonds of a shared, secret history. He had answered Arthur's call without hesitation, the summons a debt of honor that he was more than willing to repay. He found Arthur in his penthouse, looking out over the glittering, indifferent city, a glass of single malt whiskey in his hand. Chloe, the young nurse, was there, a silent, watchful presence. She had become more than just a caregiver. She was a confidant, an ally, a woman who had seen the strength and the honor that lay beneath Arthur's frail exterior. She had become the daughter he had always deserved. Thorne nodded to her, a silent acknowledgment of her loyalty, and then turned to his old friend. "You're looking well, Arthur. The accommodations are a significant improvement over the last place we shared a roof." Arthur managed a faint, crooked smile. His speech was slowly returning, the words still a struggle, but the clarity of his mind was undiminished. "The company is better." Thorne poured himself a drink, his movements precise and economical. "I saw your daughter downstairs. She looks troubled." "A temporary condition," Arthur said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "She requires a more permanent education." Thorne took a slow, deliberate sip of his whiskey. "I've been making some inquiries, as you requested. Your daughter's business empire is a house of cards, built on a foundation of leverage and speculation. It's vulnerable. A strong wind could bring the whole thing down." "I am the wind," Arthur said, his voice gaining a sliver of its old, quiet authority. The words were a simple statement of fact, devoid of malice or triumph. They were the words of a man who had spent a lifetime understanding the subtle, inexorable forces that shaped the world. A man who knew that true power was not in the shouting, but in the silence, not in the grand gesture, but in the quiet, meticulous application of pressure. Jessica, in her desperation, had started digging into her father's past. She had hired private investigators, a team of expensive, high-power professionals who were used to uncovering the secrets of the rich and powerful. But the trail was cold. It was as if her father had been born the day he had married her mother. There were no records, no school transcripts, no birth certificates. Just a blank, impenetrable wall of silence. The investigators were baffled. They had never encountered anything like it. It was as if they were chasing a ghost, a man who had managed to erase himself from the world. One of the investigators, a young, ambitious man named Ben Carter, was different. He was a former military intelligence officer, a man who had been trained to see the patterns that others missed, to read the signs that were hidden in plain sight. He was the observer, the audience surrogate, the one who would begin to connect the dots. He had noticed a faded tattoo on Arthur's forearm, a detail that had been captured in a candid photograph taken outside the hospital. It was a small, insignificant detail to anyone else, but to Ben, it was a clue. He had seen symbols like it before, in the shadowy, classified world of special operations. He started digging not into public records, but into the deep, hidden archives of military history, a world of redacted files and classified missions. And slowly, piece by painstaking piece, he began to uncover the truth. A name that was not Arthur Ashford. A list of commendations that were so secret. They were officially non-existent. A series of operations in the world's most dangerous hotspots. Missions that had changed the course of history, but had never been acknowledged. He was beginning to understand. The quiet, unassuming old man was not a failure. He was a legend, a ghost who had walked through fire and emerged unscathed. And he was beginning to realize, with a growing sense of awe and a healthy dose of fear, that Jessica Ashford was not just fighting a legal battle with her father. She was playing a game with a grandmaster, a man who was always 3 moves ahead, a man who was about to deliver a checkmate that she would never see coming. Ben Carter knew he was in over his head. The information he was uncovering was not just sensitive, it was dangerous. He knew that there were people in the world who would kill to keep these secrets buried, but he was also a man of principle, and he was beginning to feel a sense of loyalty, not to his client, but to the man she was trying to destroy. He made a decision. He would not give the information to Jessica. He would give it to the only other person who seemed to be on Arthur's side. He would give it to Chloe. He arranged a meeting, a clandestine encounter in a quiet, anonymous coffee shop. He laid out the files on the table, the redacted documents, the grainy photographs, the cryptic after-action reports. And he told her everything he had found. Chloe listened, her face pale, her eyes wide with mixture of shock and awe. The quiet, gentle old man she had been caring for, the man she had come to see as a father figure, was a hero, a man who had lived a life of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. And she understood with a sudden, chilling clarity the true depth of Jessica's betrayal. It was not just a daughter's disrespect. It was an act of profound, unforgivable ignorance. It was a desecration of a legacy that she had never even known existed. The stage was now set for the final act. The witness had been found. The evidence had been gathered. And the vindicator was about to make his entrance. It would not be in a courtroom or a boardroom. It would be in a place that Jessica considered her own personal kingdom, the place where her power and influence were on full public display. The annual Ashford Foundation Charity Gala, a glittering high society event that was the crown jewel of her social calendar. It was an evening of champagne and fake smiles, of self-congratulation and performative philanthropy. And it was about to become the scene of a reckoning that no one, least of all Jessica Ashford, would ever forget. The Ashford Foundation Charity Gala was the glittering apex of Jessica's social world. It was an event she orchestrated with military precision, a grand performance designed to showcase her wealth, her influence, and her carefully curated public image of benevolent philanthropy. The ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel was a sea of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos, a symphony of clinking champagne flutes, and the low, self-satisfied hum of the city's elite. Jessica moved through the crowd like a queen surveying her kingdom, her smile, radiant, her every gesture a study in practiced grace. She was the star of her own show, the center of her own universe. She had managed, through a combination of sheer will and financial wizardry, to stave off the collapse of her business empire. She had convinced herself that her father's actions were the last, desperate gambit of a bitter, senile old man. She had dismissed the whispers and rumors, the cold shoulders and the canceled deals, as the petty jealousies of lesser mortals. Tonight was her vindication, a public reaffirmation of her power and her place at the top of the food chain. She was about to take the stage to deliver the keynote address, a self-congratulatory speech about the importance of family and legacy, a piece of breathtaking hypocrisy that she would deliver with a straight face and a heart of stone. And then the doors to the ballroom swung open. A sudden, expectant silence fell over the crowd, and in the doorway, framed by the soft, golden light of the chandeliers, stood a group of men who did not belong in this world of glittering artifice. They were not dressed in tuxedos. They wore the crisp, immaculate uniforms of the United States military, their chests a rainbow of medals and ribbons, a silent, breathtaking testament to their service and their sacrifice. At their center, his face a mask of grim, unyielding authority, was General Marcus Thorne. The crowd parted before them like the Red Sea, a wave of stunned, reverent silence. The air crackled with sudden, palpable tension, a sense of gravitas that was utterly alien to this frivolous, self-absorbed gathering. Jessica froze, the microphone in her hand suddenly feeling as heavy as a block of lead. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, panicked bird in a gilded cage. This was impossible. This couldn't be happening. General Thorne and his men moved through the room with a deliberate, unhurried pace, their boots echoing on the marble floor with a sound like the slow, inexorable tolling of a bell. They did not look at the stunned faces of the assembled guests. Their eyes were fixed on one person, and one person only, Jessica. They stopped at the foot of the stage, a silent, formidable wall of military honor. And then General Thorne spoke, his voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the silent, cavernous room. It was a voice accustomed to command, a voice that had sent men into battle and brought them home again. It was a voice that did not brook argument or dissent. "Jessica Ashford," he said, his voice as cold and hard as polished steel. "We are here tonight on behalf of a man you know as your father, a man you have publicly and privately disowned, a man you have called a burden." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the sea of shocked, upturned faces. "But you don't know who he is. You have never known." And then he began to speak. And as he spoke, he painted a picture, not with words, but with facts. Cold, hard, undeniable facts. He spoke of a young man who had given up a brilliant future to serve his country in its darkest hour. He spoke of a secret, elite unit, a team of ghosts who had operated in the shadows, who had fought and bled and died without recognition or reward. He spoke of missions that had changed the course of history, of acts of courage that beggar belief. He spoke of a man who had been a legend in a world that did not exist on any map, a man whose real name was not Arthur Ashford, but a name that was spoken in hushed, reverent tones in the highest echelons of military intelligence, a man who had been awarded every medal for valor his country had to offer, medals he had never worn, honors he had never claimed. And as he spoke, a large screen behind the stage, a screen that had been intended to display a slideshow of Jessica's philanthropic triumphs, flickered to life, and on it appeared a series of images. A young Arthur, his face lean and hard, his eyes burning with fierce, unwavering intensity. A group of young men in dusty, blood-stained uniforms, their arms slung around each other in a gesture of weary, unbreakable camaraderie. A faded photograph of the tattoo on Arthur's forearm, the insignia of a unit so secret. Its very existence was a classified document. And then a list began to scroll down the screen. A list of commendations, of medals, of citations for bravery. The Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, the Purple Heart with 4 oak leaf clusters. A list so long, so impossibly distinguished, that a collective gasp rippled through the stunned, silent crowd. The man they had all dismissed as a quiet, unassuming old man was a giant, a hero of a stature that most of them could not even comprehend. The silence in the room was absolute, a thick, heavy blanket of awe and shame. Jessica stood on the stage, her face ashen, her body trembling. The world she had so carefully constructed, the life she had so ruthlessly pursued, had been shattered into a million pieces. The man she called a burden was a man to whom the entire nation owed an unpayable debt of gratitude. He was not just her father. He was a national treasure. General Thorne finished his speech. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His words had been a series of devastating, perfectly aimed hammer blows, and they had demolished the foundations of Jessica's world. He turned, without another word, and he and his men began to walk out of the ballroom. As they reached the doorway, they stopped, they turned, and they rendered a slow, perfect salute, not to the crowd, not to the flags that adorned the stage, but to a single, empty chair that had been placed unnoticed at a table in the back of the room, a chair that was meant for the guest of honor, a chair that was meant for Arthur. And then they were gone, leaving behind a room full of shattered illusions and a woman who had just learned the true, devastating meaning of the word honor. The climax was not an explosion. It was a silence, a profound, echoing silence that was more powerful than any speech, more damning than any accusation. It was the silence of a truth that could no longer be denied. And in that silence, Jessica Ashford was utterly and irrevocably alone. The silence that followed General Thorne's departure was a living thing, a palpable presence that filled every corner of the vast, opulent ballroom. It was a silence thick with the weight of shattered assumptions and the dawning, uncomfortable light of truth. The glittering, self-absorbed crowd, the titans of industry and the doyens of society, were for once in their lives rendered speechless. They had come for a night of performative charity and social climbing, and had instead been confronted with a reality that was far too raw, too profound for their jaded sensibilities. They had been in the presence of something real, something authentic, and the experience had left them feeling hollow and vaguely ashamed. They looked at Jessica no longer with envy or admiration, but with a mixture of pity and contempt. She was a woman who had been given a diamond and had mistaken it for a stone. She had been the daughter of a king and had treated him like a pauper. Her fall from grace was not just a social demotion. It was a moral indictment. Jessica stood on the stage, a solitary, pathetic figure under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the spotlights. The microphone had slipped from her numb fingers, and it lay on the floor a silent, useless object. Her carefully prepared speech, a masterpiece of self-aggrandizing hypocrisy, lay scattered. At her feet, the words now meaningless, absurd. She looked out to sea of faces, and for the first time, she saw not adoring fans, but a jury, and their verdict was unanimous. She was guilty of a blindness so profound. It was a form of sacrilege, guilty of a cruelty so casual. It was a form of evil. She stumbled off the stage, her movements clumsy, uncoordinated, her Louboutin heels catching on the plush carpet. She didn't look at anyone. She couldn't. The weight of their collective judgment was a physical force, a crushing pressure that was suffocating her. She fled the ballroom. Her flight, not a dramatic exit, but a desperate, panicked scramble for the nearest door. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew that she had to get away from the silence, from the judgment, from the ghost of the man she had never known. She found herself in a dimly lit service corridor, the air thick with the smell of stale champagne and wilted flowers. She leaned against the cold, unyielding wall, her body racked with dry, racking sobs. It was not a grief for her father. It was a grief for herself, for the life she had built, now a pile of smoking rubble, for the identity she had so carefully constructed, now a hollow, meaningless shell. In the days that followed, the story of the Ashford Foundation Charity Gala became the stuff of legend. It was recounted in hushed, reverent tones in the city's most exclusive clubs and boardrooms. It was a modern-day fable, a cautionary tale about the dangers of arrogance and the surprising, often hidden, nature of true worth. Jessica's business empire, already teetering on the brink, collapsed. Her partners deserted her. Her investors pulled out. Her clients vanished. She was a pariah, a woman whose name was synonymous with disgrace. She was forced to sell her penthouse, her designer wardrobe, her collection of expensive, meaningless art. She was stripped of all the trappings of her former life, left with nothing but the bitter, galling dregs of her own failure. She tried, one last time, to reach her father. She went to his apartment building, not as the queen of the city, but as a supplicant, a beggar. She stood on the pavement, a small, insignificant figure in the shadow of the towering, indifferent building. She waited for hours, a cold, persistent rain soaking her to the bone. And then the sleek, black car pulled up to the curb, and this time it was her father who emerged. He was in his wheelchair, pushed by the ever-present Chloe. He looked at her, his expression not of anger, not of triumph, but of a deep, profound sadness. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was a judgment, a final, unalterable verdict. He had not sought revenge in conventional sense. He had not sought to destroy her. He had simply sought to teach her, to show her the true meaning of value, of honor, of a life lived with purpose. He had held up a mirror to her soul, and he had forced her to look at the empty, desolate landscape within. He had restored his own honor, not by fighting, but by revealing the truth. He had won the war not with a bang, but with a whisper. He turned, and Chloe pushed him back into the waiting car. And as the car pulled away, leaving Jessica alone in the rain. She finally understood. The burden had never been him. It had always been her. Her ambition, her arrogance, her ignorance. She was a burden, and it was a weight she would have to carry for the rest of her life. Arthur, for his part, had found a new sense of peace. He had spent a lifetime in the shadows, a lifetime of quiet, unacknowledged service. He had never sought recognition or reward, but in the end, he had been given something far more valuable. He had been given a witness to his life, his courage, his sacrifice, and in the quiet, gentle presence of Chloe, he had been given something else. He had been given a family, not a family of blood, but a family of the heart, a family built on a foundation of respect, of loyalty, of love. It was a quiet, unassuming resolution to a life that had been anything but for Arthur it was enough. It was more than enough. He had faced down his last enemy, and he had won. The quiet, understated elegance of Arthur's penthouse was a world away from the sterile confines of the hospital room where this journey had begun. The relentless hum of the fluorescent lights had been replaced by the gentle, rhythmic ticking of an antique grandfather clock, a sound that spoke of time not as a commodity to be managed, but as a river to be navigated with patience and grace. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows was a breathtaking panorama of the city, a glittering tapestry of lights and shadows, a world that Arthur now observed with a sense of serene, philosophical detachment. He was no longer a player in its frantic, relentless game. He was an observer, a chronicler, a man who had earned the right to simply be. His health, under Chloe's devoted, expert care, had stabilized. The stroke had left its mark, a slight limp, a lingering weakness in his left hand, a whisper of a slur in his speech. But these were mere physical imperfections, the honorable scars of a battle fought and won. The man himself, the core of his being, was not just intact. It was stronger, more resilient than ever before. He had found a new routine, a new rhythm to his days. Mornings were spent in the sun-drenched library, surrounded by the comforting presence of his beloved books. The scent of old paper and leather a familiar, welcome balm to his soul. He read not with the desperate hunger of a man trying to escape the world, but with the quiet, contemplative curiosity of a man trying to understand it. Afternoons were for walks in the park. Chloe by his side, their conversations a gentle, meandering stream of shared observations and quiet reflections. She had become the anchor of his new life, a source of warmth and laughter in the quiet twilight of his years. She was the daughter he had always wanted, the family he had never had. He had made her the sole heir to his vast hidden fortune, a decision he had made not out of spite for Jessica, but out of a deep, abiding sense of justice. Chloe had not asked for his wealth. She had not even known of its existence. She had cared for him, respected him, loved him, when he had had nothing, or so she had thought. She had seen the man, not the money, and for that, in Arthur's quiet, unwavering code of honor, she had earned everything. He had not forgotten Jessica. He had not forgiven her. Some wounds, he knew, were too deep, some betrayals too profound, to ever be truly mended. But he had let go of the anger, the bitterness, the desire for retribution. He had found a different kind of peace, a peace that came not from victory, but from vindication, a peace that came from knowing that he had lived his life, both in the shadows and in the light, with honor and with purpose. One afternoon, as he and Chloe were sitting on a park bench, watching the children play, a young man approached them. He was tall and athletic, with a kind, open face and a respectful, almost deferential demeanor. It was Ben Carter, the young investigator who had been the first to uncover the truth of Arthur's past. He had left his high-powered, high-paying job. He had found it to be a world as hollow and as morally bankrupt as Jessica's. He had decided, instead, to use his skills for a different purpose. He had started a small, non-profit organization dedicated to helping veterans, to telling their stories, to ensuring that their sacrifices were never forgotten. He had come to ask Arthur for his blessing, for his support, not for his money, but for his wisdom, for his guidance, for the quiet strength of his example. Arthur looked at the young man, and he saw a reflection of his own younger self, a man of principle, of integrity, of a quiet, unwavering commitment to a cause greater than himself. He saw a future for the values he had held so dear, a legacy that would endure long after he was gone. He said nothing. He simply reached out his good hand, and he placed it on the young man's shoulder. And in that simple, silent gesture, a torch was passed. A legacy was secured. The quiet hero had found his successor, and the circle was complete. The final lesson was a simple one, a truth that had been the guiding principle of Arthur's entire life. True wealth is not measured in dollars and cents, but in the richness of one's character. True power is not in the ability to command others, but in the quiet, unwavering command of oneself. And true honor is not in the accolades of the world, but in the silent, unshakable knowledge that one has lived and lived well. It was a lesson that Arthur had learned in the crucible of secret war, a lesson he had taught his arrogant, unseeing daughter, and a lesson that he had now passed on to a new generation. And as he sat on the park bench, the warm afternoon sun on his face, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of trees, he knew, with a deep, abiding certainty, that it was a lesson that would never be forgotten. What is the true measure of a person's worth? Is it the wealth they accumulate, the power they wield, the status they achieve? Or is it something quieter, something deeper, something that cannot be bought or sold, but can only be earned through a lifetime of quiet, unassuming integrity? This has been a story of Arthur Ashford, a man the world had dismissed, a man his own daughter had called a burden. But as we have seen, the quietest waters often run the deepest, and the most unassuming facades can hide the most extraordinary of souls. Arthur's story is a powerful reminder that we should never judge a book by its cover, that we should never underestimate the quiet, unseen strength of those around us. It is a story about the devastating consequences of disrespect and the enduring power of honor. It is a story that asks us to look beyond the superficial trappings of success and to recognize the true and often hidden value of a life lived with courage, with principle, and with quiet, unwavering commitment to a cause greater than oneself. We have seen how a daughter's cruel words, born of ignorance and arrogance, set in motion a chain of events that would not only shatter her own life, but would also bring to light a legacy of heroism that had been hidden for decades. We have seen how a father's quiet, meticulous revenge was not an act of destruction, but an act of education, a lesson in humility, in respect, in the true meaning of wealth. And we have seen how, in the end, true vindication comes not from the humiliation of one's enemies, but from a quiet, unshakable affirmation of one's own worth. It is a story that will stay with us, a story that will challenge us, a story that will inspire us. We invite you to reflect on the lessons of Arthur's life. Have you ever underestimated someone, only to discover their hidden depths? Have you ever witnessed an act of quiet, unassuming heroism? Have you ever been the recipient of a kindness that you did not deserve, a grace that you had not earned? Share your stories with us in the comments below. We want to hear from you. We want to create a community of viewers who, like Arthur, understand the value of a life lived with honor and with purpose. And if this story has touched you, if it has made you think, if it has inspired you to look at the world and at the people around you with a new sense of wonder and a new sense of respect, then we ask you to do one more thing. Subscribe to our channel, join our community, and help us to continue to tell the stories that matter, the stories that remind us of the best of who we can be, the stories that prove, time and time again, that the quietest voices often have the most important things to say. Thank you for watching, and may you always have the wisdom to see the hero in the humble, the strength in the silent, and the diamond in the rough. Until next time, stay strong, stay honorable, and never, ever let anyone tell you that you are a burden. Your worth is not for them to decide. It is for you to know, and for you to live every single day, in every single way, with every single breath you take. It is your story. It is your legacy. Make it a story worth telling. Make it a legacy worth remembering. Make it a life of quiet strength. And now, as we close, we leave you with one final question. A question to carry with you, to ponder, to discuss. Who are the quiet heroes in your life? And how will you honor them today? The answer to that question, we believe, has the power to change the world. One act of kindness, one gesture of respect, one moment of recognition at a time. Thank you and good night.